I've sat in that building longer than I ever planned to. I've read the briefs no one else gets. I've watched presidents choose in real time between restraint and spectacle. And one thing has stuck with me every single time. The presidency is the most powerful office on earth, but the difference between a serious executive and a dangerous one is not how often the pen gets picked up. It is what the pen is being pointed at. Earlier this week, the current holder of that office signed an executive decree renaming a body of water that has carried the same name since the 1700s, instructing every federal map and database to call it, from this moment forward, Lake America. I want to walk you through what just happened and why, because while the order almost reads as comic relief, the engine behind it is anything but a joke. So let me lay the scene properly. On the night of August 21st, the trade talks between Washington and Ottawa collapse at the edge of a midnight deadline. By sunrise, roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods flowing south were carrying a fresh 50% tariff: hockey sticks, cement, steel, aluminum, the kind of ordinary products that cross and recross the longest undefended border on the planet every week of the year. Prime Minister Mark Carney answered within days. He chose a word that Canadians do not use lightly. He said the relationship had become an economic war. He announced that starting September 8th, Canada would impose mirror tariffs of its own, roughly dollar for dollar, on hundreds of American goods, steel and aluminum flowing north, dairy and appliances, farm equipment and machinery. Over 700 individual product lines affected, source Reuters, on 19.9 billion Canadian dollars. Canadian retaliatory package, effective September 8, 2026. Source NYT, on Canada's 50/25/15% tariff schedule. That is how things stood the morning the president picked up his pen. Now, I want to be fair here, because a fair read of this is the only read worth your time. There are real grievances in this trading relationship. I sat across the table from our partners through 2 trade rounds in the 1990s, and I will tell you straight, no agreement is ever finished. Canada shields its dairy market. Softwood lumber has been a running fight for 40 years. Supply-managed sectors in Ottawa have resisted opening for decades. Those are legitimate concerns. If the pitch from the president's supporters is that he is fighting for a fairer shake for American workers, I take the underlying argument seriously and reject the method. But I do not pretend the concern is invented. Here is the honest part. Renaming a lake is not a tariff strategy. It is not an instrument of economic statecraft. It is not a negotiating chip. It is a gesture. And when you are the most powerful country on earth, gestures are never free. Every one of them costs something, even when the cameras cheer. Now let me slow this down, because this is precisely the layer that the nightly broadcast cannot hold. The numbers too granular, the legal scaffolding too dense, the supply chain mapping too tedious for 3 minutes of prime time. I keep a short daily briefing called the Frontline Brief that lays out the actual mechanics of what is moving. 5 minutes a day, and you walk away knowing the real figures, the real dates, the real product lines. If you want to actually follow this story rather than absorb fragments of it, the link is in the description. Let me walk you through the lake properly, because the lake is the headline, but the lake is also the entire symbolic structure. Lake Ontario sits in the chain of Great Lakes along the northern border. The international line runs through the middle of it, with the state of New York on one shore and the Canadian province of Ontario on the other. The name itself is Haudenosaunee, an Iroquois word, translating roughly to a phrase describing something like a beautiful sheet of shining water. That name entered European cartography by the early 1600s, more than 2 centuries before either of our modern nations existed. The Canadian province of Ontario was named after the water beneath it, not the other way around. For more than a century, the United States and Canada have jointly managed these waters through the International Joint Commission, an institution created under the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, which remains one of the longest unbroken environmental cooperation frameworks on the planet. Source: U.S. Embassy Canada on U.S.-Canada policy and history. Layered on top of that is a 1989 bilateral instrument governing how both countries handle names for any geographic feature that crosses the border. Both governments committed to coordinate changes, to preserve historical names absent serious cause, and to apply a high bar before altering anything the public relies on. Source: ANS Names, U.S./Canada Transboundary Features Agreement, 1989. The order signed this week did none of that. It simply told the Interior Department to push an update through the federal naming database. Source: NBC News live blog on Lake America, EO. Source: AP News. Trump signs order renaming Lake Ontario as Lake America. Canada has already announced publicly that they will not adopt the new label on their side of the border. So in plain terms, we have the President of the United States unilaterally relabeling a body of water that two sovereign democracies share, a body of water that indigenous nations named centuries before either of those democracies existed, and he did it in the middle of a live trade dispute. Let me tell you why this troubles me as someone who actually had to sit behind the desk. When you occupy that office, your words are not personal property the way they are for a senator or a mayor. Every statement, every order, every camera moment gets read instantly by allies, by adversaries, by trading desks in Singapore and Tokyo, by your own citizens trying to figure out whether their government is still a reliable partner. When my administration was navigating the Kosovo crisis, opening trade with Beijing, or holding Moscow accountable after the Soviet collapse, that was the constant question being asked of us by every partner in the room. Can we count on these people? Do they honor their word? Are they adults? What happened this week sent an answer to all of those questions, and it is not a comforting one. It tells Canada, our closest ally and our largest bilateral trading partner, that this White House is willing to treat the alliance as a prop. It tells our NATO partners who are watching this episode in real time that the prevailing instinct in Washington right now is to chase headlines rather than resolve disputes. And it tells every foreign cabinet currently negotiating anything with the United States that the levers of this presidency can be pulled not to win a serious argument, but to embarrass the person across the table. That approach does not loosen people up. Public humiliation does not produce concessions. It produces political immobility on the other side and on your own. Now look at what Canada already has on the table. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has publicly floated cutting electricity exports southward. Canada supplies a meaningful share of the power that keeps American homes, hospitals, and factories running across the Northeast. Canada supplies the critical minerals that no Western defense supply chain can substitute for. Canada supplies auto parts that cross the border again and again during the assembly of a single truck. A vehicle assembled in Michigan may stamp, weld, paint, and finish across 4, 5, 6 border crossings before it ever sees a dealership lot. Unwinding that quietly is impossible. Unwinding it on a one-year timeline is impossible. Unwinding it without significant job losses on both sides is not possible. The mapping of which retaliatory measures touch which American industries, on which dates, in what order, is the kind of detail your nightly broadcast does not have the airtime to cover. The Frontline Brief does. 5 minutes. Worth your morning. So where does this end? A few possible paths, and I want to be honest that none of them got easier after the order this week. The hopeful read is that this was pure theater, that serious people behind the scenes are quietly talking, and that in a matter of weeks we wake up to a deal that protects American jobs and preserves the alliance. I would love to believe that is what is happening. Based on what I am seeing and hearing, I do not think it is the most likely outcome. The realistic scenario is a stretched-out economic confrontation with our immediate neighbor. September 8th is the day that matters most. That is when Canada's full retaliatory package activates. 50% on American steel and aluminum crossing north, 25% on dairy and a curated list of consumer goods, fresh duties on paper products, on construction inputs, on heavy machinery. And the president has publicly warned that he is considering pushing auto tariffs to 50% as well, potentially as soon as January. If that lands, the manufacturing spine of Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana is in serious trouble, and we are not talking about abstract jobs. We are talking about union payrolls. We are talking about plant towns where the closing of one facility empties the high school, the diner, and the church in a single quarter. The auto supply chain makes that point in human terms. The steel for a stamped door panel may be milled in Hamilton, sent to Lordstown for forming, shipped to Windsor for subassembly, returned to Ohio for paint, and crossed one more time for powertrain integration before the finished vehicle rolls off a Michigan line carrying a serial number that suggests it was built in one place. Break any of those links under tariff pressure and the line stops within days. because inventory buffers are trimmed to the bone by decades of just-in-time optimization. There is a quieter cost that will not appear in the headline numbers until long after the cameras move on. The diplomatic capital our trade representatives spent decades building with provincial officials, cabinet ministers, opposition leaders who may run the next government lives in the room, not in a press release. It is gone the first time the other side decides the United States is no longer negotiating in good faith. Rebuilding it takes a generation. Spending it takes an afternoon. So the people who pay are always the ones who did not sign anything. The dairy farmer in Wisconsin whose export window just slammed shut overnight. The line worker in Brampton or Windsor whose shift just got cut. The family in upstate New York whose grocery bill jumped this week because a supply chain they never had to think about just became measurably more expensive. If you do one thing after watching this, and I am serious, open the Frontline Brief. It tells you exactly which products your household will feel first, the precise timeline for each round of duties, and the early warning signs that distinguish a path toward negotiation from a path toward escalation. 5 minutes. You deserve to be the most informed person in whatever room you walk into tomorrow. I want to leave you with one thought, and then I will let you go. America's strength has never come from its capacity to mock its neighbors. It has come from the capacity to organize coalitions, to set the standard for what responsible governance actually looks like in a complicated world, and to keep commitments even when keeping them costs something. When my time in that office ended, I was proud that our allies still trusted us, that when we sat down with another country, our partners believed we were there to find the answer, not to put on a show for the camera.